Alrighty, the Carolinas. First of all, it started out just being Carolina. It was just one big place. Um, King Charles II gave Carolina to some of his friends, 8 of his friends, noble friends, as a proprietary colony. Now let's remember, proprietary colony means that they owned it and they made all the decisions for it. And so it's not a question of a house of Burgesses or anything like that. They owned it. Now, I don't think that any of them came over to run the place, but that's how it was supposed to be. They owned it and could make all the decisions for it. So with this piece of land, which is a pretty big piece of land, the nobles set up estates for some lesser people who could buy that land, or they could rent that land for them. And then as the people made money off of it, they were supposed to send some of that money back to the nobles. So again, it's sort of a money-making proposition for the nobles. Now, the most important thing off this frame actually is John Locke. You have to remember him. He's very important. He's going to be important for you from now till the time you graduate from college, because even if you take any American history or even European history during college, he will be mentioned and you'll need to know about him. So they needed a set of rules for their colonies, and they're like, okay, Locke, help us out with that. And Locke wrote a constitution up for the colonies. And he had some pretty basic rules and regulations that people were supposed to follow in, well, it was not colonies at that point, it was just one colony called Carolina. One of the major items in Locke's constitution was that it said, specifically, the labor of a person's body and the work of his hands are properly his, meaning that if you achieve something through your own work, then you should be able to keep it. Now, that doesn't sound very controversial, and it wasn't at the time, because the people that were taking up the land for the nobles understood and agreed to the fact that they were going to send part of their money back to the nobles. That was understood. However, later on, when the colonists decide to write a Declaration of Independence and a Constitution, they look at Locke's words and say, oh, we're supposed to be able to keep what we've earned? Well, you're taking it away from us, so not so much. So those words become important later on, and John Locke's thinking becomes very important later on. Now, the Carolinas split in two for economic reasons. Virginia has a very good port. Norfolk it's a naval port, and a port for other reasons, but it's a big naval shipyard for us right now. But North Carolina doesn't have a good port, and North Carolina's agriculture and growing crops that they can grow is much like Virginia's. And so over time, North Carolina kind of split off and became North Carolina rather than just being one big Carolina. And they identified more with Virginia. Farmers in Northern Carolina grew tobacco, they sold timber and tar, which I've got a little picture of over there on the side. Now, North Carolina is known as, it's called the Tar Heel State, and there's a reason for that. If you go vacationing in North Carolina and you go swimming out in the ocean and you walk around out there, you're liable to come in with this black sticky stuff on your feet. And it's not because of pollution, and it's not because of a big tanker wreck off the coast or anything. It's because there are natural tar seeps off the coast of North Carolina. And that stuff was valuable for back in those days. They used it to waterproof the bottom of ships and things like that. And so it was a natural resource that they could sell for money, and they did. And they weren't the only people who did it. The people off the coast of Texas could do the same thing when they found natural tar seeps there as well, with the Spanish, of course. Now, so that's how North Carolina split off, and that's for that reason. Okay, South Carolina used the port of Charlestown, named after King Charles, as their port, and it's a very good harbor as well. And they traded deerskin lumber as well, because lumber is a big deal. Like I told you, it's the oil of the time. It's a huge, big deal. England had mostly deforested their little island nation. And wood is what you need for building ships, for building homes, for fuel. To heat your homes in the wintertime, it's what they use. They didn't even know so much about heating with coal at that point. They still used that wood for everything. So the fact that North America is covered with dense forests was a big deal for them. So that was part of what they traded from North America back over to England. Now, South Carolina is much more low-lying than North Carolina. It's swampy. Think of it more like Florida. It's very much more flat and much more swampy. And so the crops you can grow in South Carolina mostly do not include tobacco. But rice grows well there, and something called indigo. And you need to remember Eliza Lucas off this frame. Not too many women are known as farmers, especially from back in those days. But she saw the opportunity to bring the crop of indigo to South Carolina. And indigo was an important cash crop because if you will see, like the picture I've shown you down here in the far left-hand corner, the little blue flowers. Those little blue flowers are used to dye cotton cloth. It's a deep blue, permanent dye that is used to dye cotton cloth even today. The cotton that we call denim. Your blue jeans are more likely than not dyed with indigo. Not always, because we have other ways of dyeing them now, but a lot of them are still dyed with indigo. But again, these crops are all labor intensive. Every crop was labor intensive. I don't care what crop you want to name, because there's no such thing as farm machinery, even much of it pulled by horses and whatnot. It's still all, if there's a pest on your crop, it has to be picked off and crushed by hand. Any fertilization has to be done by hand. Any harvesting, any planting, it all has to be done by hand. And so, again, slavery comes in very handy for North and South Carolina, and they used slavery just like Virginia did. All right, Georgia was the very last colony formed by the British, and it was founded by James Oglethorpe, and I think you need to remember his name. I'm not sure if he's tested or not, but he's worth remembering, one way or the other. Notice it's very late in time. Look, it's over 100 years after even Plymouth. It's 1733, very late. And it was founded for debtors. Because in England during these times, if you owed money to someone, you were basically just thrown in prison. So, for example, if in present day I have a credit card and I run up a big credit card bill, and I owe the bank a lot of money on that credit card, but I can't pay them, what happens in present day is I will go to the bank and I will work out a payment system. Now, I won't be allowed to charge any more money on that credit card, but in the meantime, I will work on paying off that credit card debt a little at a time. But if I had lived in jolly old England, I wouldn't have that option. I would simply be thrown in jail because I owe too much money. Problem being with that is, there is no possible way I can earn any money to pay off my debt if I'm sitting in prison. So Oglethorpe said, how about, because we have a new king by now, King George II, how about, Your Highness, how about if I make a colony where these people can go and just go away from here? Because let's face it, if we have to throw them in jail, we have to put clothes on their back, and we have to heat them up enough in the wintertime to keep them warm, and we have to feed them for the rest of their lives. And this might be an alternative. I mean, we wouldn't force them, but it might be an alternative for just debtors. We're not talking about hardcore convicts and criminals. We're just talking about people who owe money. And so this became an option for people. And if you are a person who owes money and you're sitting in front of a judge in England and you are told you can either go to jail or you can go to Georgia, I'm sure many, many people took advantage of this and said, oh, I'd rather go to Georgia. And it was a fresh start for many people. It was better than going to jail. And it would be hard for them maybe to come over here and make a fresh start with nothing. But it was better than going to jail. And so it was a good place for them as an alternative. However, it wasn't just out of the niceness of his heart that Oglethorpe came up with this idea. And it wasn't just because the king was being nice that he agreed to this plan. There was the problem of Spanish Florida. That was just south of there, and just south of the Carolinas that were very profitable with their indigo and their rice and their tobacco. And they don't want the Spanish to come up out of Florida and cause them any problem. And so Georgia is also founded as sort of a buffer between the Spanish who are in Florida and the Carolinas to keep the Spanish out. So it is successful on a couple fronts. It gives debtors in England a place to go, and they were hoping it would become economically profitable, which that didn't happen. Um, it's good for debtors, but it doesn't then turn money back to England. But it does serve as a buffer between England and Spain. And so now we've gone through all the colonies, the New England, the Middle, and the Southern, and they all have different ways of making a living and different reasons for founding. And you need to remember that some of them were for religious reasons, some of them, most of them, lots of them, were for economic reasons.